Okay, continuing on with our discussion on the hydraulic lifters, we're also going to include the solid lifters, more discussion on that, as well as a little bit about the valve train system in the radial engine. Um, but to start off, we'll talk about, we've got these situations where we've got excessive valve clearance, and like I said, there's just a plethora, a whole bunch of test questions that deal with either excessive clearance or having inadequate clearance. So we'll get to the inadequate one here in just a bit, where meaning you don't have enough clearance. So, we said our dry tappet clearance needs to be between 28 and 80,000. We depress the rocker arm and stick a feeler gauge in there. So, if we have too much clearance, the lifter may not pump up properly with oil and cause some valve train problems, or if it's inadequate, then it does not pump up and you may not have proper lubrication, and it needs to give that little squirt 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 as it's operating to lubricate the overhead. So we'll get to that inadequate, like I said, in just a minute. But on the excessive clearance, one of the test questions talks about, so what happens if we have excessive valve clearance? And the answer to that, one of those, is you have a reduced valve overlap period. So if we're taking a look at, so in green here, I've got my intake valve opening up here. And of course, as we mentioned, it's got a duration to it where it comes clear over here and finally closes on the intake closing, finally closes on the compression stroke. But if I have excessive valve clearance from what it's supposed to be, as we mentioned before, the valve is going to open late and close early. So this IO point is going to move over here, and the IC is going to move over here. So where I might have had before, I had like maybe 25 degrees or something here, and I got maybe 25 over here, where I had a total valve overlap of 50 degrees. So if this shortened up, and of course, and then there's things that can happen. I'll talk about that, how valves can get adjusted improperly. But so now the EC is happening a little earlier. I now have a reduced valve overlap period. And then as well as I have the total duration of the valve being open would be reduced, and that would be an answer to another question, having that total duration of the valve opening timing incorrect. So one of our aircraft out there, the Cessna 152, it does not have hydraulic lifters in it. It has a solid lifter. And this is the guy here. So your push rod sits in here like this. And so when we go to adjust that clearance, so just like if you were doing the dry tappet clearance where you do it, you would push down on the rock arm. But in the book, they give you a cold clearance and a hot clearance. So on that Cessna 152, if you were measuring the clearance on the valve train when it's cold, it's like 3 thousandths. If the engine is warm, and now how warm can vary. So the warm clearance they give you is like anywhere from about 12 to 18 thousandths. So depending on what kind of warm temperature you're at, it could be a little greater due to more elongation due to the extra warm temperature. So there's another question kind of related to this style. What would happen if I used the hot clearance, that 12 to 18, when the engine is cold? Okay, so looking at, of course, where that guy lives in the engine, of course, so normally where your hydraulic lifter is living in your cam follower, this guy is here, and then, of course, I push on this, and if the engine's cold, I'm supposed to have 3 thousandths. But if I started off with the 18 thousandths while the engine is cold, then of course as cylinder elongation happens, then that clearance would be 24, 28, whatever. It would grow quite a bit. So now I would have that excessive valve clearance. So back to the question, what would happen if I use the hot clearance while the engine is cold? Again, that would lead back to that excessive valve clearance, meaning the valves would open late and close early, as we diagrammed up there on our chart. Another thing, this whole, what was the main reason for valve overlap was volumetric efficiency. So if I don't have the proper amount of valve duration and thus valve overlap period, I'm going to have another answer to the question is decreased volumetric efficiency. And then one of the test questions, they assume that, so you screwed up and used that hot clearance. And so the question's worded basically, well, what would happen to my valve durations? So we're basically saying we've screwed up all the clearances. So that would cause a decrease in valve opening for both the intake and the exhaust. So just coming at you with another way to word the question addressing the same topic. Okay, let's talk a little bit about inadequate valve clearance. I'll tell you a little story that relates with this. On our radial engine out there, we had a situation where when we started up the engine was cold, it was misfiring. One cylinder was not firing. And so and this was, when we did this, it came after, had some students that knew they were going to go to Alaska and be working on a lot of radial engine aircraft. So they asked permission to do some extra work, stay after school, and took 2 or 3 cylinders for experience off of the radial engine. And then they had the cylinders off of it, and we hung a note on the prop that says, do not rotate the propeller. And because that'll be one thing I'll show you later, is how close those rings actually come down to the bottom of the cylinder. The rings come right down near the bottom. And with a radial engine, we'll learn about the master rod and articulating rods a little bit later. We get into our radial engine stuff. Can move, and things can come with the cylinder not supporting the connecting rod in the center of the cylinder where it's supposed to be. So we hung a note, said, do not rotate the prop. So, of course, we come in the next morning after the night class had been in the building, and I guess to some people, when you have something that says, do not do something, that, of course, means go ahead and do it. Well, so the prop was sitting in a different spot, and it was locked up. In some of the other cylinders, the rings had popped out of several cylinders. So that forced us to have to remove additional cylinders. Well, in radial engines, when you put it back together, you have to go through a process of adjusting the valves, as you know, with the cylinders all around the thing. So some of the smaller radial engines, of course, so they have what they call a cam ring. So instead of having a cam shaft, they're going to have a cam ring in them. And then here's this roller device I was telling you about, or like the roller follower that rides on there. So this is called a cam ring. You're going to have a row for your intake valves and a row for your exhaust valves on this thing. Well, on our 985 out there, the cam ring does not have the setter support, and it's known as a floating cam ring. So I'll get us up out of the chair here, and we'll walk out and take a look at the floating cam ring. Our R2800 out here has the same thing, where you've got the floating cam ring in it. And so you see how there's no center support, how I can stick my hand through there. And then, of course, there's a cam ring back here for this rear row of cylinders. And then there's a cam ring up front there for the front row of cylinders. So when you have in fact, there's a test question on radial engine stuff. When you have a floating cam ring, what's the procedure for adjusting valve clearances? I have to go around and depress, take out the clearance of certain valve push assemblies on this, and then go on the opposite side and adjust that clearance in that valve. And you have to go through in this as a sequence chart that we'll be learning about later at that process. So our students went through that, and they messed up. They ended up having inadequate valve clearance. And so where they were supposed to have like probably that 3,000ths or something, it actually was to the point where it was holding the valve off its seat. So there's a test question that talks about what happens if you have inadequate clearance. And the answer to that question is you will not have valve seating during engine startup and warm-up. But then as we were running the engine, we ran it for a few minutes and we went around and felt cylinders. You know, how do I determine a cold cylinder? Basically feel it. And I felt the cylinder. It's cold. What the heck's going on? What's going on? Did we check spark plugs and things like that? So then we put it, you know, back together and we ran it again. And then after a little while, the cylinder was now running. And of course, why is that happening? Of course, cylinder elongation, as the heat was propagating around from the other engine cylinders that were running, that engine elongation took place. So where we had inadequate clearance, holding the valve off of its seat, it was now seating properly, and compression came back, and the valve cylinders operating normally, although it still didn't have the right clearance. So then the next day we come out to run the engine, and same thing happened again. And so it took us a couple days to figure out what was going on where we had that inadequate clearance and had to go back through and readjust all the valve train stuff again. So a little story related with that valve clearance. Now, we just talked about in the previous video where how do you adjust, you know, when you have hydraulic lifters, how do you adjust the clearance of the valve train? And of course, we mentioned that you replace push rods. Well, of course, now we got test world mixed up with real world. And so a lot of you are going to be working on the 0320 H2AD, and you will not be replacing push rods to adjust the valve train. What the H2AD has, of course, it's got the hydraulic lifter. It looks kind of automotive-ish up there. And here's your push rod coming down your valve train here. And then here's some studs in your H2AD. And of course, now to adjust in those rocker arm clearances, there's these shims in here. It looks like I got this picture upside down. How shame on me. Let me turn that over for a second. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so we've got these shims in here that, so when you take this engine apart, you want to make sure you keep track of those shims, because if you mess up and put the shims in the wrong spots or you didn't know they were there, you're going to really lengthen your time of reassembly, because at least what was in there was probably somewhat close and might need a minor adjustment of a shim or two. But if you have to start from scratch, you'll want to kick yourself for doing it. Now, one problem here. These shims actually live down under here. So when you remove the rocker arm, the shims are going to be sitting right down on these studs. And you want to make sure that some of them didn't come out with the center fulcrum piece that sits on those shims on there. So yeah, on the H2AD, make sure you keep track of those shims. Now, hopefully I caught all that in the picture okay as I was wiggling the camera around there. Yeah, then, so we talked about dry tappet clearance, and another question that was done was they express, you know, what's going to happen if your hydraulic lifter is flat or empty is the word, and which is when we're putting the engine together. That's what we mean, because that's why we took the lifter apart, got all the oil out of it, and made it flat or empty is the word, so that we can check our dry tappet clearance. But when a hydraulic lifter is flat or empty, then your clearance on the valve train, checking valve dry tappet clearance, should not exceed a specified amount above zero. So I mentioned in the previous video, when you're putting those kind of engines together, well, even the H2AD though, the 0320 H2AD with its hydraulic lifter that you adjust with the shims, you're still going for that 28 to 80 thousandths. That is the proper clearance on that valve train. Okay, I think, let me scan my parts here, make sure I got everything. So I talked about the solid lifter, talked about the roller that rides on the cam ring. So we got that style, as well as our two types of hydraulic lifters that we talked about. Okay, that should wrap that up.